You don't own this driveway, Arthur. The community owns it. And as of this morning, you are trespassing on a public easement. That was how my Tuesday began. Not with the quiet peace of a freshly brewed cup of black coffee on my porch. Not with the familiar, while comforting sound of the wind rustling through the old oak trees that lined the street. It began with the shrill, grating voice of Beatrice Loxley, cutting through the crisp autumn air like a dull hacksaw. It was 7:15 in the morning. The October dew was still heavy and silver on the manicured lawns of Whispering Pines. An upscale, hyper-regulated subdivision in the quiet suburbs of Columbus, Ohio. To the outside world, this neighborhood was a picture-perfect postcard of suburban tranquility. To those of us who lived here, it was a beautifully landscaped prison, and Beatrice was its self-appointed warden. I was standing at the end of my long stamped concrete driveway, holding the morning paper. Beatrice, or B, as she insisted people call her. Despite lacking even a single drop of the warmth that nickname implied, was standing exactly 1 inch from the edge of my concrete. Her arms were crossed tightly over a pastel pink cardigan that looked entirely too thin for the biting morning chill. Her posture was rigid, radiating an aura of absolute, unquestioned entitlement. She was flanked by a man holding a heavy aluminum clipboard and wearing a neon yellow safety vest. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, while shifting his weight from one work boot to the other, actively avoiding my gaze. "Good morning to you too, Beatrice." "Lie," I said. My voice was low and steady. I didn't raise it. I didn't flinch. After 35 years working as a structural engineer, managing high-stress commercial construction sites with millions of dollars and hundreds of lives on the line, I had learned a fundamental truth about human conflict. The person who raises their voice first is usually the one who has already lost the argument. Volume is the refuge of the weak. I'm fairly certain my deed says otherwise. I continued, taking a slow sip of my coffee, letting the steam rise between us. I've owned this house, and this specific piece of concrete, for 12 years. Your deed is outdated, Arthur, she snapped, a smug, triumphant smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She looked at me not as a neighbor, but as a minor pest she was about to exterminate. The Homeowners Association Board conducted a comprehensive review of the 1995 subdivision plat maps last night. We discovered an anomaly. Your driveway was built directly over a historic community access easement. It was originally designed for golf cart traffic and pedestrian thoroughfare. We are reclaiming it for the neighborhood. I stared at her in silence for a long moment. Whispering Pines didn't even have a golf course. The nearest country club was 6 miles away. A golf cart path, I repeated slowly, letting the sheer absurdity of the words hang in the freezing air. A multi-use pedestrian and light vehicle corridor. While she corrected sharply, waving her hand dismissively as if brushing away a fly. The technical terminology doesn't matter. The point, Arthur, is that you are parking your ghastly, rusting old pickup truck on community property. Effective immediately. You are fined $100 per day until the vehicle is removed. Well, she didn't stop there. She stepped slightly to the side, gesturing grandly to the nervous man in the safety vest. Furthermore, the board has authorized this contractor to begin marking the concrete for demolition. We will be breaking up this section next week to restore the path. My eyes shifted from Beatrice to the contractor. He looked like he wanted the earth to open up and swallow him whole. Is that true? I asked him, my tone dropping an octave, losing any trace of morning pleasantry. You're standing in front of a man's private home, preparing to mark up his driveway for demolition. Based on a late-night HOA board meeting? The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He held his clipboard up like a flimsy shield. Look, buddy, I just go where the work orders tell me. I just got hired to take some measurements and spray the cut lines. She told me the HOA owns this strip. Well, she lied to you, I said simply. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten him with physical violence. I just stated it as an absolute undeniable law of physics. If you press the nozzle on that can of marking paint and let one single drop hit my concrete, I will immediately file a police report for malicious vandalism. And after the police leave, I will personally sue your company, your bonding agency, and you individually for the cost of a full structural replacement of this entire 80-foot driveway. This is private property. Make your choice. The contractor froze. He looked at my face, realizing instantly that I wasn't bluffing. He was a working man. He knew the difference between suburban bluster and a genuine legal threat. He took 3 massive steps backward, lowering his clipboard entirely. I'm not getting involved in a legal dispute over a property line. Lady, he muttered to Beatrice, shaking his head. Call my office when you have a judge's signature on a court order. He turned his back on her, walked briskly toward his idling work truck parked on the street, and drove away without looking back. Beatrice's face flushed a deep, mottled, furious red. The carefully constructed illusion of her absolute authority was unraveling in real time, and she hated it. You think you can intimidate my vendors? She hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. In her rage, she took a step forward, crossing the invisible property line, her expensive leather shoes planting themselves firmly on my concrete. You think because you're some retired engineer, sitting alone in this house all day, that the rules don't apply to you? I am the president of this association. Arthur. I am revitalizing this neighborhood. That truck is a disgusting eyesore. This driveway is an illegal encroachment. And it is coming down. I will ruin you with fines if I have to. Well, step off my property. Beatrice, I said. The warmth in my eyes was entirely gone. I am standing on a community easement. She shrieked, her composure fully broken. I didn't argue. I reached into the deep pocket of my flannel jacket, pulled out my smartphone, and tapped the screen. The red recording dot appeared. I held the phone up, steady, ensuring her furious face and her position on my driveway were perfectly in frame. For the record, I said, speaking clearly and clinically into the microphone, it is 7:22 a.m. on October 14th. Beatrice Loxley, acting completely outside the scope of any legal or municipal authority, is currently trespassing on my private property. She has actively threatened the structural demolition of my home's infrastructure. Beatrice, you are on camera, and I am officially asking you to leave my land. Her eyes darted to the glowing screen of the phone. The bravado faltered for a fraction of a second. She knew the camera fundamentally changed the dynamic of power. Though she wasn't just bullying a quiet, older man on his porch anymore, she was creating a permanent digital footprint of harassment. You'll be hearing from the HOA's legal counsel by the end of the week, she spat, though her voice lacked its previous volume. She turned on her heel and marched rapidly back down the street toward her massive, A sprawling estate at the end of the cul-de-sac. I stopped recording. I lowered the phone, closed my eyes, and let out a long, slow, shuddering breath. The coffee in my other hand had gone completely cold, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I turned around and looked at my home. Not specifically. I looked down at the stamped concrete beneath my boots and then up at the faded, beautifully maintained 1978 Ford F-150 parked near the garage. Beatrice called it a ghastly old pickup truck. Why, she saw an eyesore. She saw something that didn't fit her sterile, catalog-perfect vision of suburban royalty. But she didn't know what that truck, or this driveway, actually meant to me. 12 years ago, when my wife Sarah and I bought this house, the driveway was nothing but cracked, weed-infested asphalt. I was still working 60-hour weeks at the engineering firm, but Sarah insisted we didn't hire a crew to fix it. "We're building our forever home, Artie," she had told me, her eyes bright with that stubborn, beautiful determination I loved so much. "We're going to pour it ourselves. We're going to put our sweat into the ground." We did. For 3 grueling weeks during a sweltering July, we rented a mixer. We built the wooden forms. We poured yard after yard of heavy concrete. I can still close my eyes and see her, wearing an oversized t-shirt covered in gray dust, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of a dirty glove, laughing uncontrollably as we struggled to stamp the slate pattern into the wet cement before it cured. Down near the garage, hidden under a potted fern, were our initials S traced forever into the stone. And the truck. That F-150 was the vehicle we had driven across the country on our honeymoon. It was the truck that had carried every piece of lumber for the garden beds she loved. Even now, 3 years after cancer had taken her from me, the cab of that old Ford still carried the faintest impossible scent of her vanilla perfume mixed with motor oil. This house wasn't just real estate. This driveway wasn't just an access route. It was a monument to the woman I loved. It was the physical manifestation of the life we had built together. It was my sanctuary. It was since Sarah passed away. I had become the invisible neighbor. I kept my lawn neat, paid my dues on time, when kept to myself. I just wanted to be left in peace with my memories. But standing there in the cold October air, the analytical, problem-solving part of my brain, the part that had spent decades calculating load-bearing tolerances and stress fractures, clicked violently into gear. Beatrice Loxley had just declared war. She wanted to bring a demolition crew to tear up the concrete Sarah and I had poured by hand. She wanted to weaponize a neighborhood committee to erase my sanctuary. A quiet, dangerous calm washed over me. I walked up the steps to my front door. The grief that usually sat heavy in my chest was suddenly replaced by a cold, mathematical focus. Beatrice thought she was dealing with a tired, lonely old man who would easily fold under bureaucratic pressure. When she was about to find out exactly what happens when you threaten the foundation of a structural engineer's home, I didn't go back outside immediately. Instead, I walked into the kitchen, poured the cold coffee down the stainless steel sink, and brewed a fresh pot. The aroma of dark roast filled the room, a grounding, familiar scent that helped quiet the adrenaline still humming in my veins. I took my mug to the large bay window in the living room and parted the heavy curtains just an inch. From here, I had a clear vantage point of the street. Beatrice hadn't gone home, with having failed to break me. She was now seeking an easier target to reassert her dominance. She was standing on the sidewalk in front of George's house, directly across the street. George was a good kid, maybe 32 years old, a pediatric nurse who worked exhausting 12-hour shifts. He and his wife had moved in 2 years ago with their toddler, a sweet little girl named Lily. They were exactly the kind of vibrant, hard-working family that a neighborhood should be desperate to attract. But to Beatrice, they were just another source of non-compliance revenue. I watched as George stood on his front porch, wearing faded hospital scrubs, his shoulders slumped in sheer exhaustion. Beatrice was pointing her clipboard aggressively at a small, beautiful cedar swing set George had built for Lily over the weekend. It was tucked neatly into the side yard, barely visible from the street. Behind Beatrice stood Kevin and Linda, 2 members of the HOA board. They were perfectly nice people in isolation, but in Beatrice's presence, they were reduced to silent, spineless henchmen. They stared at their shoes while Beatrice berated George, citing some obscure architectural guideline about disrupting the visual uniformity of the neighborhood sightlines. Even through the double-paned glass of my window, I could see the defeat wash over George's face. He didn't have the energy to fight. He didn't have the money for a lawyer. He just nodded, running a hand over his face, promising to take the swing set down by the weekend. Beatrice smiled that same toxic, triumphant smirk she had given me, made a sharp checkmark on her clipboard, and marched away, her court of jesters following closely behind. My grip tightened around the ceramic handle of my coffee mug until my knuckles turned white. Beatrice Loxley wasn't just a nuisance, she was a neighborhood parasite. She fed on the exhaustion and fear of working families, while she had weaponized the covenants, one-pat conditions, and restrictions, years of whispering pines, turning a document meant to protect property values into an instrument of psychological terror. While she thought she was untouchable because nobody had the specialized knowledge or the sheer willpower to challenge her interpretation of the rules. She had just picked a fight with the wrong man. I turned away from the window and walked down the hallway to my home office. The room was a sanctuary of a different kind. It smelled of aged paper, graphite, and old wood. A massive, angled drafting table dominated the center of the room, flanked by heavy oak filing cabinets. For 35 years, this was where I brought work home. This was where I had calculated wind shear tolerances for skyscrapers and load-bearing capacities for commercial suspension bridges. I sat down in my worn leather chair, booted up my desktop computer, and put my reading glasses on. The grief and anger receded, safely compartmentalized. The widower on the porch was gone. The structural engineer was now at the wheel. The building either supports the load, or it fails, I muttered to myself in the quiet room. The legal claim is either supported by evidence, or it collapses. Beatrice's claim that morning had been incredibly specific. But she hadn't just complained about my truck. She claimed the board had conducted a comprehensive review of the 1995 plat maps and discovered a historic community access easement designed for golf cart traffic. People like Beatrice don't dive into 20-year-old county archives on a whim. They don't dig for obscure easements unless they are looking for a very specific loophole to exploit. She had a motive. I just needed to find it. I opened my web browser and navigated to the Oak Haven County Geographic Information Systems GIS portal. It was a public database used by tax assessors and municipal planners. I typed in my address and hit enter. The screen flickered, loading a high-resolution aerial satellite view of our cul-de-sac. The digital property lines were overlaid in bright neon green, segmenting the neighborhood into neat geometric parcels. I zoomed in on my property. My lot was deep and narrow, like a rectangle stretched too far. The long, stamped concrete driveway ran straight down the left side, terminating at my detached garage. Then, I panned the map to the right, looking at Beatrice's property. Her lot was massive, a sprawling, pie-shaped piece of land at the very end of the cul-de-sac. Over the last 5 years, as her husband's logistics company had expanded, Beatrice had transformed the property into a monument to suburban excess. In 2019, she had hired contractors to build a massive, oversized 3-car garage extension. In 2022, she added a luxurious, custom-built she shed in the backyard, complete with Roman columns. I stared at the screen, my eyes tracing the neon green lines. I engaged the digital measuring tool on the GIS interface. Okay, Beatrice, I whispered, clicking my mouse. Let's play your game. If the HOA was magically claiming a 10-foot wide strip of my driveway as a golf cart path, where would that path logically go? It couldn't just go straight back toward the rear of my property. It would smash directly into my garage. A path needs a destination. It has to curve. I drew a 10-foot wide digital radius, starting from the street, running up my driveway, and curving it gently toward the back right of my property line. I clicked to finish the measurement and sat back in my chair. A cold, hard, humorless laugh escaped my chest, echoing in the silent office. The imaginary path didn't lead to a community park. It didn't lead to a public greenbelt. The sweeping, 10-foot wide arc perfectly bypassed the tight, difficult turn of the cul-de-sac, cut directly across my property line, and terminated exactly at the massive side doors of Beatrice Loxley's new 3-car garage. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. She didn't want a pedestrian corridor. She wanted a secondary, private access road for her own estate. Your husband had likely bought a massive luxury RV or a large boat, and they realized they couldn't maneuver a 40-foot trailer through the narrow constraints of the cul-de-sac turnaround. Instead of paying for a redesign of her own landscaping, Beatrice had decided to simply steal her neighbor's land. And the most brilliant, insidious part of her plan was that she wasn't using her own money to do it. She had manipulated the HOA board into believing the land belonged to the community, meaning she was using the association's legal budget and authority to forcefully seize a private driveway for her personal convenience. It was a masterstroke of suburban corruption. It was also a blatant, prosecutable fraud. I rolled my chair over to the bottom drawer of my heaviest filing cabinet, the one labeled House Docs Vital. The steel drawer glided open smoothly. I bypassed the folders, holding the mortgage paperwork, the home insurance policies, and the appliance warranties. I went straight to the back and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. It contained the closing documents from 12 years ago. More importantly, it contained the title insurance packet and the original boundary survey. I cleared my desk, pushing my keyboard aside, and carefully unfolded the large, 24 by 36-inch blueprint. It was a beautiful, crisp blue-line survey map, stamped with the raised, embossed seal of a licensed county surveyor, dated 2014. To a layman, the boundary survey is just a confusing web of intersecting lines, degrees, minutes, and seconds. But to a structural engineer, it is a sacred text. It is the absolute, mathematical truth of the earth. I traced my finger along the left boundary line, noting the exact dimensions of my property. There it was, My stamped concrete driveway was sitting precisely 24 inches inside my property line. I checked the legend and the encumbrance notes. There were standard utility easements for the water main near the street. There was a 5-foot drainage easement at the very rear of the lot. But there were no right-of-way corridors. There were no community access paths. The historic 1995 golf cart easement was a complete fabrication. A phantom line Beatrice had drawn in her head to justify her land grab. I had the silver bullet. I had the physical proof. I could simply scan this document, email it to the HOA property management company, threaten them with a lawsuit for extortion. And the entire issue would evaporate by dinner time. Beatrice would be exposed as a liar, and my driveway would be safe. I reached for my phone to call the management company, but my hand stopped halfway across the desk. In my 35 years of engineering, I had trained my eyes to look for anomalies. When you inspect a massive concrete pillar, you don't look at the whole pillar, you look for the hairline fracture, the millimeter-wide rough stress crack that tells you the foundation is shifting. My eyes drifted to the right side of the paper blueprint, to the boundary line that separated my property from Beatrice's lot. I leaned over the desk, pulling a magnifying glass from my pen cup. I looked closely at the geometry of the line. It didn't run perfectly straight from the street to the back fence. It ran straight for exactly 120 feet, and then, near the rear third of the property, it took a slight, strange dogleg angle, a 4-degree shift toward Beatrice's side of the lot. I looked back up at my computer monitor, bringing the current GIS satellite map back into focus. I visually overlaid the precise geometry of my 2014 survey map onto the 2023 satellite image of Beatrice's sprawling backyard. My heart skipped a beat in my chest. Beatrice's massive 3-car garage extension had been built in 2019. Her ridiculously opulent Greek temple, she shed, had been built in 2022. Both of those heavy, permanent, poured concrete structures were located right at the back corner of her property, right where the boundary line took that unexpected 4-degree dogleg. When homeowners expand their suburban empires, especially arrogant ones who believe they own the neighborhood, they rarely spend the $2,000 required to hire a professional surveyor. They look at the existing line of privacy hedges or an old wooden fence, and they simply assume that foliage dictates the legal boundary. I stared at the screen, doing the spatial math in my head. If Beatrice had assumed the boundary was a straight line, and she built her garage right up to the edge of the hedges, she didn't just miscalculate. She had entirely missed the dogleg. County GIS maps are notoriously inaccurate for legal disputes. They are rough digital estimations meant for tax assessment, not millimeter-precise court battles. The satellite photo could be slightly skewed by the curvature of the earth or the angle of the camera. You can never trust the digital lines drawn on a screen to prove an encroachment. But you can trust the physical iron monuments driven deep into the bedrock by the original developers. I didn't need to call the HOA management company anymore. I needed to see the physical pins. I pushed my chair back, walked out of my office, and headed for the garage. I grabbed my heavy-duty metal detector, a commercial-grade tool I used for finding rebar in concrete slabs, a flathead shovel, and a 100-foot spool of bright orange masonry string. Beatrice Loxley wanted to wage a war over a phantom path. She was perfectly willing to destroy a young father's swing set, and she was entirely prepared to bring a bulldozer to the driveway my dead wife and I had built with our bare hands. She wanted a war over property lines. I was going to give her one, I stepped out through the back door of my garage, the heavy-duty metal detector gripped firmly in my right hand, a flathead shovel and a tape measure slung over my left shoulder. The mid-October air had warmed slightly, but the ground was still damp and soft. I walked toward the far right corner of my backyard, where a thick, imposing wall of 10-foot-tall arborvitae privacy hedges separated my property from Beatrice's sprawling estate. But to the untrained eye, those hedges were the absolute edge of the world. They were thick, dense, and had been there for at least 2 decades, planted by the original owners long before Beatrice or I ever signed a deed. Over the years, as Beatrice expanded her footprint, it was obvious she had looked at that wall of green and simply assumed it was the legal boundary line. It's a remarkably common mistake in the suburbs. People trust what they can see. Engineers only trust what they can prove. I turned on the metal detector. The device emitted a low, rhythmic hum. I started at the edge of the hedges, calculating the rough trajectory based on the dogleg angle I had seen on my 2014 survey map. I swept the sensor back and forth over the grass, taking slow, methodical steps. For 10 minutes, there was nothing but the steady hum. Then, about 3 feet inside the line of Beatrice's beloved privacy hedges, the machine let out a sharp, high-pitched shriek. I dropped to my knees in the damp grass. I set the metal detector aside, took my flathead trowel, and began to carefully cut through the topsoil. I didn't dig wildly, I excavated like an archaeologist. About 4 inches down, scraping past layers of dead roots and packed clay, the metal blade of my trowel struck something hard with a dull clink. I brushed the dark earth away with my gloved hands. There it was. It was a half-inch, heavily rusted iron rebar rod, driven deep into the bedrock of Ohio. Capping the rusted metal was a faded, cracked yellow plastic disc, faintly stamped with a multi-digit surveyor's license number. I sat back on my heels and stared at it. In a world of HOA guidelines, aesthetic, committees, and neighborhood gossip, this little piece of rusted iron was the only thing that actually mattered. It was the rear corner pin. The absolute, mathematically unarguable anchor point of the property line, established by the county when the land was first subdivided. It didn't care about Beatrice's ego, and it didn't care about her clipboard. I hooked the metal end of my heavy-duty tape measure onto the iron pin. I stood up and walked a perfectly straight line back toward the front of the house, stopping at the exact dimension listed on my survey. I found the second pin near the street in less than 2 minutes, without even needing the metal detector. It was buried just beneath the mulch of my front flower bed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a spool of bright orange masonry string line. I tied one end securely to the front pin. I pulled the spool with me as I walked back to the rear of the property, pulling the neon orange thread incredibly taut, ensuring there was absolutely no slack, and tied it firmly to the rear pin. The bright orange string now hung suspended 3 inches above the grass. It was a perfect, merciless, mathematically absolute line slicing between our 2 properties. I stood back, wiped the dirt from my hands, and looked at the result. I checked my driveway first. The stamped concrete where Sarah and I had carved our initials was completely safe. Well, it sat a comfortable, undeniable 24 inches on my side of the orange string. Beatrice's claim of an encroaching golf cart path was officially, physically dead. But as I followed the bright orange line with my eyes, tracing it toward the back of the lot where it met the dogleg angle, my breath literally caught in my throat. The line didn't just run parallel to Beatrice's new structures. It ran directly through them. Because Beatrice had assumed the hedges were the property line, she had instructed her contractors to pour the massive concrete foundation for her 3-car garage extension right up to the edge of the bushes. I walked up to the side of her pristine, custom-built garage. I looked down at the orange string. The back left corner of the heavy, load-bearing concrete structure extended exactly 4 feet and 3 inches over the string line. I walked further back to her luxurious she shed, a $20,000 miniature Greek temple she used for hosting neighborhood wine nights. It was even worse. Almost half of the entire structure, 8 feet and 6 inches of it, was sitting squarely on my side of the property line. She hadn't bothered to spend a fraction of her construction budget on a professional survey. Well, she had built a $50,000 garage extension and a lavish outbuilding on land she didn't own. She had built them on my land. I stood there in the quiet of the morning, staring at the orange string intersecting the solid concrete. The sheer magnitude of her mistake, the catastrophic arrogance required to pour a permanent foundation without verifying the dirt beneath it, washed over me. For the first time in months, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. Beatrice Loxley wanted to wage a war over a phantom golf cart path. She wanted to use the HOA to steal a 10-foot strip of my driveway so her husband could park his toys. She had no idea that she had just handed me the legal bulldozer required to crush her entire kingdom. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in bureaucratic harassment. Beatrice, having been publicly humiliated by the contractor refusing to paint my driveway, realized she couldn't immediately force physical demolition without a court order. So she resorted to the coward's weapon. She weaponized the HOA's fine system to break me psychologically. It started that very next Monday. Like clockwork, the mail carrier walked up my driveway and handed me a certified envelope from the Oak Ridge Property Management Company, the corporate entity that handled the HOA's administrative dirty work. I opened it at my kitchen island. It was a formal citation. Violation 1. Unauthorized commercial vehicle parked in residential driveway referencing my pristine 1978 F-150. Violation 2. Failure to maintain right-of-way clearance, citing a small potted fern sitting on my own concrete. Violation 3. Obstructing a designated community easement, citing the driveway itself. Each violation carried a $50 fine, compounding daily. The letters arrived every single day. By the end of the second week, the management company claimed I owed the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association nearly $3,000. But Beatrice didn't stop at mail. She wanted a public execution. On a Thursday afternoon, while I was out buying groceries, she personally walked onto my porch and slapped a massive, bright orange sticker on my front door. It read, in bold, terrifying black letters, notice of lien intent. She placed it perfectly at eye level, ensuring that every neighbor walking their dog or driving past would see that Arthur Pendleton was a delinquent facing the potential seizure of his home. I saw George, the young nurse from across the street, looking at the sticker with absolute horror in his eyes as he pulled into his driveway. He looked at me with deep sympathy, silently praying he would never draw Beatrice's wrath to that extent. The psychological toll of boundary disputes and HOA harassment is often far more exhausting than the financial cost. It creates a persistent, suffocating, low-level anxiety. You feel unsafe in your own home. Every time a car slows down in front of your house, your heart rate spikes. Every time the doorbell rings, you expect a process server. It is exactly this psychological pressure that suburban bullies rely on. They construct a mountain of paperwork and threats, hoping the victim will eventually collapse under the weight of the stress. They want you to panic. They want you to call the management company, crying, begging for a compromise, offering to surrender a strip of land just to make the relentless fines stop. I didn't call the management company. I didn't panic. I didn't even peel the orange sticker off my front door. I carefully removed each certified letter from its envelope, punched 3 holes in the paper, and placed them into a heavy black binder on my desk labeled exhibits. I was completely detaching emotion from the problem. I wasn't a grieving widower being bullied. I was an engineer preparing a demolition plan. And instead of arguing with Beatrice, I was busy executing a flawless legal strike. First, I needed unassailable ammunition. I hired a highly reputable, independent surveying firm from 3 counties over the kind of firm that specialized in multi-million-dollar commercial boundary disputes and expert witness testimony. I paid them a premium to come out quietly on a Wednesday afternoon. Specifically, during the hours I knew Beatrice was at her weekly country club luncheon. They didn't just string a line. They set up heavy robotic total stations and GPS rovers that communicated directly with municipal satellites. They located all 4 corner pins of my property. They verified the exact degrees and dimensions against the original 1995 subdivision plat map filed with the county clerk. 2 days later, they handed me a beautiful certified, heavily stamped boundary survey. It was a legally binding document that confirmed everything my orange string line had shown. The concrete driveway was entirely mine. Beatrice's 3-car garage encroached onto my property by exactly 4.25 feet. The she shed encroached by 8.6 feet. Second, I needed a weapon. I contacted a real estate attorney named David Hirsch. David was a shark wrapped in a tailored tweed suit. I had worked with him on massive commercial construction disputes over a decade ago. He was a brilliant litigator who absolutely despised arrogant developers and power-hungry neighborhood tyrants. I walked into his downtown office. He sat the heavy black binder of HO fines on his mahogany desk and laid the certified stamped boundary survey right next to it. While David put on his reading glasses, tracing the lines on the survey, a slow, predatory grin spread across his face. "Arthur," David chuckled, tapping the survey with his expensive silver pen. "This isn't just a fence built a few inches over the line. Because her garage sits on a poured, load-bearing concrete foundation, this constitutes a permanent hostile trespass. And the fact that she is actively using her position as HOA president to harass you over the very boundary line she is violently violating. Well, any judge in this county is going to look at her with absolute disgust. This fundamental misunderstanding of the law is so common among these overly zealous community leaders," David continued, leaning back in his leather chair, while steepling his fingers. "They confuse a neighborhood aesthetic committee with actual municipal jurisdiction. An HOA cannot vote an easement into existence without a recorded deed modification. She's playing pretend government. I want it gone. David," I told him plainly, "I'm going to draft a civil complaint for ejectment." "Family," David said, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. "I'll specifically cite the precedent established in Myers v. McCoy, the landmark Ohio case that firmly protects landowners from unintentional encroachments by neighbors who fail to obtain proper boundary surveys before building. The burden of proof rests entirely on Beatrice. She must prove that she had a legal right to build there, or that the statutory period for adverse possession has been met." "Adverse possession?" I asked. "Squatters' rights, essentially." David, explained. But in Ohio, adverse possession requires 21 years of open, notorious, and hostile possession. She built her garage 4 years ago. One, she has no claim. Based on these timelines, she is legally defenseless. I don't want a financial settlement, David. I reiterated, my voice dropping to a cold whisper. She stood in my driveway and threatened to destroy the concrete my wife and I poured together. I don't want her money. I want the structures gone. I want my land back. An action for forced removal it is. David nodded respectfully, recognizing the absolute resolve in my tone. Well, it's aggressive. It will be financially catastrophic for her. And based on this survey, it is entirely within your legal rights. I'll have the complaint filed with the County Court of Common Pleas by tomorrow morning. The legal trap was now fully set, armed, and buried. Now I just needed Beatrice to walk directly into it. And knowing her desperate need for an audience, I knew exactly where she would do it. I just had to wait for the quarterly community meeting. I didn't have to wait long to spring the trap. On the third Thursday of the month, the Whispering Pines HOA held its quarterly community meeting at the local elementary school gymnasium. Usually, these meetings were sparsely attended. Depressing affairs. They were little more than theatrical productions where Beatrice dictated new, hyper-specific rules while the few attendees sat in terrified, compliant silence. But tonight was different. Word had spread through the neighborhood grapevine about the bright orange notice of lien intent plastered on my front door. The scent of blood was in the water, and human nature drew a crowd. When I arrived 10 minutes late, carrying my thick, worn leather briefcase, there were at least 30 residents seated in the folding metal chairs. The gymnasium smelled of floor wax and stale anxiety. At the front of the room, seated behind a long folding table that served as the judge's bench, sat Beatrice Loxley. She was flanked by Kevin and Linda, the two spineless board members who looked less like community leaders and more like hostages. Beatrice was wearing a sharp, tailored blazer, holding a wooden gavel. As I pushed through the heavy double doors, the squeak of my boots on the polished hardwood floor echoed through the vast room. The ambient murmuring died instantly. The room fell dead silent. Every head turned to look at me. George, was sitting in the third row with his wife, gave me a nervous, supportive nod. Beatrice was in the middle of a sentence about standardizing the color temperatures of holiday exterior lighting, but she stopped abruptly. Her eyes locked onto me, flashing with a potent mix of surprise and predatory glee. While she couldn't believe her luck. I hadn't just surrendered in private, I had come to submit in front of an audience. Arthur Pendleton, she announced loudly, her voice echoing off the cinder block walls, making sure every person in the room heard her. How bold of you to show your face. I assume you are here to publicly submit a payment plan for the $3,200 in fines you currently owe this association? I didn't sit down in the back row. I didn't stop walking. I walked straight down the center aisle, my eyes locked dead on hers, until I stood directly in front of the board's table. I don't owe this association a dime. Beatrice, I said. My voice was calm, conversational, but I projected it from my diaphragm, so it carried easily to the back row without a microphone. And I'm not here to talk about holiday lights. I'm here to address this board's illegal, fraudulent attempt to seize my private property. Beatrice let out a harsh, theatrical laugh, looking out at the audience as if inviting them to join in on the joke. Mr. Pendleton is confused. Everyone, Lee, she said condescendingly. He has built a driveway over a community easement. We have sent him multiple legal notices. He has stubbornly ignored them. We are simply enforcing the bylaws to protect community assets. You haven't produced a single legal document proving this easement exists. I countered smoothly. Because it doesn't. We manufactured the claim to create a private access road for your new garage. A low murmur rippled through the folding chairs behind me. People were starting to whisper. I saw George lean forward, his eyes wide. Beatrice's face tightened, the smug smile vanishing. That is a defamatory lie. She snapped, bringing the plastic gavel down on the table with a sharp crack. The 1995 plat maps clearly show the right-of-way. The board voted on it. We have jurisdiction over that land. An HOA board cannot vote to steal fee simple land. Beatrice, I replied, placing my heavy leather briefcase on her table and popping the brass latches. But since you are so profoundly concerned with the precise legal location of property lines, I decided to have a professional boundary survey conducted by a licensed third-party commercial engineering firm. I pulled out 3 large, rolled-up copies of the certified survey. I unrolled the first one and laid it flat on the table, right on top of her meeting agenda. I unrolled the other 2 and handed them back to the residents sitting in the front row. They immediately huddled around the blueprints, tracing the lines. This survey was completed 3 days ago, I said, my voice cutting through the rising tension in the gymnasium. It mathematically confirms that my concrete driveway is completely within my property boundaries. There is no easement. There is no golf cart path. Your fines are entirely fraudulent. And your attempt to hire a demolition contractor to destroy my property constitutes criminal extortion. Beatrice stared down at the map. Her eyes darted over the thick black lines, the precise coordinates and the raised, the undeniable seal of the licensed surveyor. She swallowed hard, her throat visibly working, but her toxic arrogance wouldn't let her back down in front of her subjects. This is a forgery, what she stammered, though her voice lacked its usual venom, cracking slightly. You paid some friend to draw this. The HOA attorney will tear this amateur sketch apart in court. Oh, we are absolutely going to court. Beatrice, I said smoothly, leaning forward and planting both hands on the folding table, forcing her to look me in the eye. But not over my driveway. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Take a closer look at the back corner of that map. Beatrice, I instructed softly. Look at the boundary line separating our 2 lots. Beatrice looked down. I watched her eyes trace the heavy black line. I watched her process the precise mathematically absolute measurements. I watched as her brain calculated the trajectory of the line passing directly through the footprints of her beloved buildings. I watched the blood completely drain from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. You built your massive unpermitted 3-car garage extension 4 feet and 3 inches onto my property, I announced. I turned slightly, projecting my voice to ensure the entire room, including George, could hear every single word. Your expensive she shed is sitting 8.5 feet onto my land. You were so arrogant that you didn't get a survey when you built them. You just poured tons of permanent concrete on dirt that didn't belong to you. Mine, no, she whispered, her manicured hands trembling as they gripped the edges of the map. No, that's impossible. The hedges. The privacy hedges are the line. Why, hedges are plants. Beatrice. They grow. They spread. They move. I said, coldly. Iron pins driven into the bedrock of the earth by the county do not. I reached into my briefcase one last time and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, stapled in the corner with a heavy blue backing. This is a formal civil complaint filed this morning in the Oakhaven County Court of Common Pleas, I said, dropping the lawsuit onto the center of the table with a heavy, final thud. I am not suing the HOA. I am suing you, personally, for hostile trespass and permanent encroachment. I am seeking a court order for ejectment. I looked at Kevin and Linda, the two terrified board members, who were physically inching their chairs away from Beatrice as if she were radioactive. Then I looked back at Beatrice, who looked like she was about to be physically sick. I don't want your money. Beatrice, I said quietly, the steel in my voice absolute. I want my land. You have 30 days to legally dismantle and remove the encroaching structures, or I will have the county sheriff stand there while a bulldozer does it for you. Have a good evening. I turned, snapped my briefcase shut, and walked back down the aisle. Behind me, the gymnasium erupted into absolute, uncontainable chaos. Residents were shouting, lying, standing up, demanding to see the maps. Kevin and Linda were frantically whispering to each other, realizing they had been used as pawns in a fraudulent land grab. As I pushed through the double doors and out into the cool, quiet night air, I heard Beatrice's voice one last time, shrill and panicking, desperately trying to regain control of a kingdom that had just burned to the ground. The fallout was immediate, brutal and utterly catastrophic for Beatrice Loxley. The morning after the HOA meeting, the Oak Ridge Property Management Company, terrified of being named as co-conspirators in an extortion and fraud lawsuit, formally withdrew every single fine levied against me. They sent a groveling, panicked email claiming they had been grossly misled by the board president regarding the legal status of the easement. By Friday afternoon, Kevin and Linda convened an emergency executive session without Beatrice. In a matter of minutes, they voted unanimously to strip her of her presidency and remove her from the board entirely. The reign of the neighborhood tyrant was over. But the real war was happening in the legal system. Beatrice hired a high-priced, aggressive real estate defense attorney who immediately filed a motion for an injunction. He claimed adverse possession and prescriptive easement, arguing that because the hedges had been there for 20 years, the property line had legally shifted through historical use. My attorney, David, absolutely eviscerated the argument in our preliminary hearing. Your Honor, what David argued, pacing confidently before Judge Harris in the grand oak-paneled county courthouse. Adverse possession in the state of Ohio requires 21 years of open, notorious, yes, and hostile possession. The defendant built her encroaching garage in 2019. That is exactly 4 years ago. Furthermore, she cannot claim a prescriptive easement for a permanent concrete structure. She didn't plant a garden. She poured a foundation. She simply failed to do her due diligence before building on my client's land. Judge Harris, a no-nonsense man who had seen decades of property disputes, He looked at Beatrice's attorney over his reading glasses. Counsel, your client built a permanent structure over a property line without securing a basic boundary survey. The law on this is remarkably clear, and the precedent is absolute. I am denying the injunction. Mr. Pendleton has a fundamental, constitutional right to the exclusive use of his land. Beatrice was legally trapped. A week later, David called me. Beatrice had submitted a desperation settlement offer. She offered to pay me $50,000 in cash for a boundary line adjustment, essentially offering to buy the small strip of land her garage was sitting on at 10 times its actual market value. Arthur, 50 grand is a lot of money for a 4-foot strip of dirt, David advised, playing devil's advocate as any good lawyer should. If we go to trial for a final demolition order, she will drag it out. It could take months. I didn't even have to think about it. I looked out my window at my driveway. I thought about Sarah, wiping sweat from her forehead, laughing as we stamped the concrete together. David, I replied, my voice hard. She stood in my driveway and threatened to bring a crew to destroy the concrete my wife and I poured together. She weaponized a community association to try and steal my land so her husband could park an RV. If I sell her that land now, she learns that her money can buy her way out of her arrogance. Reject it without a counteroffer. I want the building gone. When the rejection came through, Beatrice finally realized that I couldn't be bought, bullied, or intimidated. The panic truly set in. Through the grapevine, mostly from George, who was absolutely relishing the drama and happily reporting it to me, I heard the details of her crumbling life. The original contractor she had hired to build the garage refused to move it, noting a standard clause in his contract stating the homeowner was solely responsible for verifying property lines. Her homeowner's insurance carrier refused to cover the claim, categorizing the encroachment as an intentional, illegal act. She was solely, personally responsible for the astronomical cost of tearing down a $50,000 structure. The day the demolition crew arrived, the entire neighborhood knew about it. It was a crisp, clear, painfully bright morning in early November. I stood on my back patio holding a warm mug of coffee, watching the scene unfold over the top of the privacy hedges. Beatrice stood on her manicured lawn, her face pale, wrapped tightly in a heavy coat, watching as a massive flatbed trailer rolled down the street. A large, yellow excavator, equipped with a hydraulic thumb, rolled off the ramp, its tracks tearing up her pristine grass. This wasn't a precision deconstruction. Moving a poured concrete foundation is physically impossible. The removal of the encroaching structures was not a vindictive act, it was a necessary, unyielding restoration of the legal boundary. The earth itself holds no memory of who claimed it, but the law requires absolute precision. The only way to remove the encroachment was to tear down the entire garage addition and break up the slab entirely. The diesel engine roared to life, while a deep, guttural sound that shook the morning air. The massive metal arm swung through the air and crashed violently through the roof of Beatrice's prized 3-car garage. Wood splintered with a deafening crack. Fiberglass insulation flew into the air like dirty snow, and the structure began to collapse in on itself. When the heavy machinery began to crack the concrete foundation, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the jackhammer wasn't just breaking stone, it was breaking the illusion of unchecked entitlement. It served as a permanent, physical reminder to the entire community that property rights are not subject to the whims of a board vote. They are anchored in the bedrock. verified by mathematics, and protected by the court. It took the crew 3 full days to rip the garage down, tear the custom she shed to pieces, and jackhammer the heavy concrete slab all the way back to the actual property line. When the dust finally settled, her massive corner lot looked like a war zone. Where her pristine, oversized garage once stood, there was now a jagged, dirt-filled, ugly scar in the earth, stopping exactly 3 inches from the bright orange string line I had run weeks ago. Beatrice didn't come outside much after that. The sheer public humiliation of having to demolish her own property because she tried to steal mine broke her spirit entirely. She put her sprawling house on the market 3 months later and moved away before spring even arrived. The new owners were a quiet, polite couple with 2 golden retrievers who introduced themselves shortly after moving in. Within a week, they hired a contractor to build a new, beautifully compliant wooden fence exactly on the surveyed property line. The peace that returned to Whispering Pines was palpable. Without a tyrant patrolling the sidewalks looking for minor infractions, residents began to interact normally again. George from across the street even hosted a block party, setting up a bounce house right in his front yard, completely free from the fear of arbitrary fines. It proved that true community is built on mutual respect and a shared understanding of boundaries, both physical and interpersonal. Goes for me. I returned to the quiet rhythm of my retirement. I still have the same stamped concrete driveway. I still park my old 1978 F-150 on it, smelling the faint trace of vanilla perfume every time I open the door. Rant, and sometimes, when I'm out, walking to the mailbox in the morning, I stop. I look down at the small AS carved into the corner of the concrete. Then, I look across the yard, at the invisible line where Beatrice's garage used to be, and I smile.